The chalk dust in room 2C smelled like every other morning, and that was exactly the problem. Mira Katsuragi sat in the third row from the window, second seat from the back, and watched Mr. Handa write the day's date on the board in handwriting that never changed. Ordinary handwriting, ordinary chalk, an ordinary square of ordinary light falling across an ordinary desk. She had spent 412 days learning to distrust exactly how comforting that was, because comfort had a way of turning into carelessness, and carelessness was how hunters died. She was not, strictly speaking, supposed to still be a hunter. That part of her life had ended the way most impossible things end, quietly, on a battlefield no one on Earth would ever hear about, with a title she hadn't asked for and a wound across her ribs that no doctor here could explain if they ever saw it. World Render, some had called her. Others just called her the girl who didn't stop coming. She had killed a god there. Not metaphorically. She had put a blade through the chest of the entity that administered the afterlife of an entire dying world, because it had decided her extinction quota for the week included 6,000 civilians in a border town, and she had disagreed loudly enough to end its career. That should have been the end of the story. Death is supposed to be permanent, even for people who kill death professionally. Instead, she'd woken up in her own bed, in her own body, 17 years old again, with her school uniform hanging on the back of her door, exactly where she'd left it a year and a half earlier, except no time had passed here at all. Same morning, same homework due, same girl 2 seats over passing her a note that said, "Did you finish the math?" Like Mira hadn't spent the equivalent of a year and a half learning to read the weather of incoming apocalypses by the taste of the air. She'd told herself, in the beginning, that it was a gift. A second chance. Rest, finally, after a war that had cost her more sleep than she liked to count. Around the desks, the ordinary morning noise rolled on. Someone's phone buzzing under a textbook, a boy in the front row arguing with his neighbor about a video game, the radiator under the window ticking as it warmed. Mira let it wash over her the way she used to let the sound of a camp settle around her before a battle. Background noise, catalogued and dismissed, useful only for telling her that nothing had changed yet. Then, 6 weeks ago, something had scratched at the edge of gym class that had no business existing in this world, and she'd understood that whatever had sent her back hadn't retired her. It had relocated her. Katsuragi. Mr. Handa's voice cut through the fog of her attention. "You're wanted in the front office." A ripple of curious murmurs went through the room, the harmless kind reserved for someone who never got called to the office. A few heads turned. Someone stage whispered a guess about detention, which made 2 others laugh under their breath. Mira gathered her bag with unhurried hands, aware that 30 pairs of eyes were doing exactly what teenage eyes do, watching for a story to tell later. And none of them noticed that her pulse hadn't changed at all, because it never did anymore, not for anything smaller than the end of the world. She noticed something else on her way out, though. Something small. The hallway was too quiet. Not silent. There was still the murmur of first-period classes through closed doors, still the far-off clatter of someone's dropped textbook 2 floors down, still a janitor's cart squeaking somewhere near the science wing. But under it, threading through the ordinary noise like a hair caught in an otherwise perfect piece of fabric, was a smell. Ozone. Wet iron. The smell of a door that shouldn't be open. Mira didn't run. Running announced things. She simply changed the angle of her walk by 11 degrees, away from the front office and toward the east stairwell, and let her school bag hang from one shoulder in a way that put her right hand free. She passed a bulletin board advertising the Fall Sports Festival, a lost and found bin overflowing with single gloves, a fire extinguisher mounted exactly where it should be, every detail of the hallway present and accounted for, which made the one wrong detail, when she finally reached it, stand out like a scream in a library. The stairwell door was propped open with a second fire extinguisher dragged from its mount, which was against every safety code the school had, and which was also not something any of the actual staff would have done on a Tuesday morning. Mira paused at the threshold, one hand resting against the frame, and looked down into the stairwell's dim, concrete throat. Something looked back. It did not have eyes in the way that word usually implies. It had 2 shallow depressions in a face that was trying, badly, to remember what a face was, for stretched across a body that folded wrong at the shoulders, for joints where there should have been 2. It was small, dog-sized, maybe, if the dog had been assembled by something that had only heard dogs described secondhand. And it was very clearly not from this world, because nothing from this world made that particular clicking sound with its throat, like a key trying every tooth of a lock at once, over and over, patient and hungry. Mira had seen worse. She had killed things that made this look like a house pet on a leash. But those things had been in a world built to hold them. This thing was in the stairwell of Keed High School, 40 feet from a cafeteria, currently preparing 316-year-olds' lunch. "You're early," she said quietly, in the flat, unbothered tone she used to use on things like this, back when using that tone had been her entire job. "The tear isn't supposed to open until dark. Someone's going to be very disappointed in you." The creature's head tilted at an angle a human neck would never survive. It lunged. She had it dead, properly, permanently dead, not the kind of dead that things from the world of death tended to shrug off. In 4 seconds, using nothing but the small pocket knife she carried for opening juice boxes and the flat of her palm to redirect its second lunge into the corner of a concrete step hard enough to end the argument. The whole thing left no blood, because things like this didn't have blood, just a fine gray ash that dissolved into nothing. Within a minute, exactly the way training had told her it would a lifetime and a world ago. What training had never told her was what to do about the door. Because there was a door now, hanging in the stairwell shadow about a foot off the ground, roughly the size and shape of a mail slot, edged in a faint violet light that pulsed like something breathing. A tear. Not a full rift. Those were the ones that swallowed city blocks whole. But a tear, the kind that leaked 1 or 2 low creatures through before it either sealed itself or, if left alone, widened at its own pace, patient the way rot is patient. She had seen exactly 1 tear before on the world she'd fought her war on, and it had taken an army of hunters 3 days to close it permanently, working in shifts, 3 of them dying in the process. Mira crouched in front of it and did the only thing she knew how to do with the resources of a 17-year-old girl standing in a stairwell during first period. She pressed 2 fingers to the edge of the light, murmured for syllables in a language that had no name on earth, and watched the tear shrink to the size of a coin, then a grain of rice, then nothing at all. The violet light guttered out like a candle pinched between finger and thumb, and the stairwell went back to smelling like industrial cleaner and old paint. It would come back. Tears always came back, smaller each time, sealed improperly, until eventually they stopped coming back small. She had bought herself, at a rough guess, 3 days. She was still crouched there, catching her breath in a way she hadn't needed to in longer than she wanted to admit, listening to her own heartbeat settle back into something ordinary, when the stairwell door creaked further open and a voice said, "That's an interesting way to skip homeroom." Mira did not startle. She had trained herself, at considerable cost, out of startling. She simply turned her head, slow and easy, and found her homeroom teacher standing in the doorway with his tie loosened and an expression on his face that had nothing to do with a man who taught first-year literature for a living. Mr. Handa was looking at the spot where the tear had been like he knew exactly what had just not been there anymore. "You're going to want to come with me," he said. "And you're going to want to skip whatever excuse you were about to give me, because I watched you close that with a seal pattern that went out of use 200 years ago on a world you've never set foot on. Until, apparently, recently." His office, if it could be called that, turned out to be a supply closet on the 2nd floor that was, on the inside, considerably larger than the outside allowed for. Mira noted the discrepancy the way she noted most impossible things now, with mild professional interest rather than alarm. A single circle of pale runes was worked into the floorboards, dim to near invisibility unless you knew to look for it. And along one wall hung a collection of weapons that any hardware store would have politely declined to stock. A row of glass jars held things that were probably teeth, arranged with the same tidy pride most teachers reserved for trophies. "You're a hunter," she said. It wasn't a question. Was. Handa poured hot water over 2 cups of tea like this was any other after-school chat between a homeroom teacher and a struggling student. 22 years, 6 worlds, 1 very bad divorce that I will not be discussing over tea. I hung it up when my knees stopped agreeing with me, and the ministry offered early retirement in exchange for keeping an eye on nexus points that pop up in ordinary places. Schools, mostly. Something about the accumulated hope and dread of adolescence makes them thin. Hospitals are the other big one, if you're curious, though for entirely different reasons. And you never mentioned this to a single student. Because in 20 years, no student has closed a first-tier tear with a fourth-generation Kesserine seal, alone, without so much as raising their pulse. He set the tea down in front of her and studied her face with the particular patience of someone who had spent decades learning to read people who did not want to be read. That seal was retired because it required a hunter to have died and come back at least once to cast it without losing a finger. So, Katsuragi, who did you used to be before you were 17 and bored in my literature class? Mira wrapped both hands around the teacup and let the silence stretch the way silence stretches before someone decides to trust a stranger with something that could get them both killed. I don't know what this world calls me, she said finally. Where I fought, they called me the World Render. I ended a war that had already lasted longer than my whole life here. I ended the thing running it. Then I woke up here, exactly where I left off, like none of it happened, except it did happen, and now something on the other side of it wants me back. Handa didn't flinch, didn't gasp, just nodded slowly, the way a man nods at whether he'd been expecting for a while. That would explain the tears, he said. They're not random. Something is triangulating, hunting for you. He tapped one finger against the rim of his own cup, thinking. The good news is, tears that small only happen when the thing hunting doesn't yet know exactly where you are. It's throwing scouts through blind, hoping one of them stumbles across your scent. The bad news is that it's getting closer. He agreed. Every scout that dies without reporting back tells it a little more about where not to look, which narrows the map fast. How many more of these do you think you can seal before it stops sending scouts and send something that can actually find you? Mira thought of the 4-second fight in the stairwell, the ease of it, the way her body had simply remembered without asking her permission. She thought of the 316-year-olds down the hall who had no idea a tear to another dimension had hung open 40 feet from their lunch trays that very morning. Not many, she admitted. And I can't have it find me here. Not with them in the building. Then you have a decision to make, Handa said, about how much of your old life you're willing to let back into your new one. Because doing this alone in secret, in a school full of children who think the scariest thing that can happen to them is a pop quiz. That's not caution, Katsuragi. That's a countdown you've decided not to look at. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs, grainy, official, the kind taken by people who did this for a living, of 3 other tiers, opened in 3 other schools across the country over the past 2 months, all sealed by unknown hands before the ministry's teams could even arrive. You're not the only one they've been trying, Mira said slowly. No, Handa said, but you're the only one still alive to close them. He let that sit for a moment before continuing, turning his own cup in slow half-circles on the desk. The other 3 were hunters too, near as the ministry can tell. Retired, relocated. Same as you, people who finished something on another world and came back to find the world hadn't finished with them. 2 of the tiers near their homes widened before anyone got there. The 3rd hunter is currently in a hospital bed that isn't listed on any public registry and isn't expected to wake up. You're telling me this to scare me into asking for help. I'm telling you this because you're going to ask anyway, eventually, and I'd rather you ask now, with all your fingers, than later, missing a few. Handa's voice didn't have any theater in it, which was somehow worse than if it had. You've been treating this like a problem you can outfight. I need you to start treating it like a war you already survived once, which means it already has a shape. Wars don't change shape just because you change worlds. Only the terrain does. Mira turned that over. Feeling the shape of the war she'd already fought settle uncomfortably close to the shape of the one apparently starting here. The same slow escalation, scouts before soldiers, soldiers before generals, always testing the boundary of what a lone hunter could hold before deciding it was worth the cost of something bigger. She had learned, over there, that the only way to survive that pattern was to break it before the enemy finished reading it. Then help me find where its patience runs out, she said, before it finds mine. For 2 of the 3 days she'd bought herself, nothing happened. which was its own kind of exhausting. Mira went to class. She turned in an essay on a novel she'd barely skimmed and got a passable grade for effort disguised as insight. She ate lunch with Aiko on the low wall behind the gymnasium, listened to a full 10 minutes of gossip about a boy in the volleyball club, and laughed in what she hoped were the right places. In the evenings, she trained. Handa's supply closet, it turned out, extended downward as well as sideways, a narrow stone stair behind a false shelf leading to a room with reinforced walls and floor markings scorched by things that had clearly gone wrong before Mira ever arrived. He ran her through drills that were laughably basic compared to what she'd survived on the other side. Footwork, breath control, the boring fundamentals every hunter cursed through in their first year. Except now she did them with a 17-year-old body that hadn't yet caught up to everything her instincts already knew. "You're overcorrecting," Handa said, watching her parry a training blade for the 5th time in a row. "You keep bracing like you're still wearing the armor you had there. You're not there anymore. Different weight, different reach, different bones. Your body is younger than your reflexes. That gap is going to get you hurt if you don't respect it." "I don't have time to relearn how to walk," Mira said, breathing harder than she wanted to admit. "You don't need to relearn how to walk. You need to remember that this body bruises, and the last one mostly didn't, not after year 1. He lowered his own blade, considering her. That's the real danger in what's coming for you. Not that you'll forget how to fight, that you'll fight like you're still unbreakable, in a body that very much is." It was annoyingly useful advice, and it was also the first time in a year and a half that anyone had spoken to her like her survival was still an open question rather than a foregone conclusion. She had gotten used to being the strongest thing in any room. Here, in a body still growing into itself, that certainty had cracks in it, and Handa was the first person willing to point at them out loud instead of flattering her into false comfort. Between drills, he asked her questions she hadn't expected a retired hunter to care about. Not about the war's final battle, which was the part everyone always wanted to hear, but about the small things, how she'd slept in the weeks before the end, whether she'd eaten properly, who had covered her back when her arm was too injured to hold a blade. She found herself answering honestly, the way she hadn't with anyone since coming home, because Handa didn't flinch at the ugly parts and didn't dress up the ones that still ached. He asked like a man cataloging damage he intended to fix, not a man collecting a war story to repeat at dinner parties. "You fought that whole war without anyone asking you those questions, didn't you?" he said, not really a question, on the second night, watching her rewrap a strained wrist with hands that had clearly done this 100 times before on 100 other students who had never known what he really was. "There wasn't time," Mira said. "Every hour I spent resting was an hour something else used to get stronger." "That's not a war strategy," Handa said. "That's a person forgetting they're allowed to be a person. Don't bring that habit into this fight. It'll get you killed here just as easily as it nearly did there." On the second night, he told her about the reclaiming nights. "If the thrones decided you're worth the resources, it won't keep sending scouts forever," he said, sliding another folder across the table. This one older, its edges soft from handling. "Eventually, it sends a knight. Bonded armor, no living mind inside it, built for one purpose, retrieval or termination, whichever comes first. They don't get lost the way scouts do. Once one locks onto a target, it doesn't stop until the job's done or the knight is." "I've fought knights before. On a battlefield built to hold something that size, with an army at your back and gear forged for exactly that fight." Handa closed the folder. "Not on a running track in front of 400 kids who think a monster is something out of a movie." Mira didn't have a good answer for that, so she didn't offer one. She simply trained harder, until her younger, breakable body ached in ways she'd forgotten a body could ache, and told herself that ache was information, not weakness. The countdown, as it turned out, ran faster than either of them guessed. 3 days later, not the safety margin she'd hoped for, but close enough that she'd almost let herself believe she'd earned it. The second tear didn't open quietly in a stairwell during first period. It opened during the fall sports festival, in the open air above the running track, in front of 400 students, a marching band mid-rehearsal, and every teacher the school employed. And it did not open small. The sky over Keed High School split like a seam torn out of dark cloth, a wound of violet light 40 feet wide. humming with a pressure that made every window on that side of the building rattle in its frame. Out of it came something that did not need to remember what a face was for, because it had never had trouble being exactly what it was. A reclaiming knight, 7 feet of black armor fused to bone that had never belonged to any living animal, carrying a blade long enough to have its own gravity, its footsteps landing on the track with a sound like a door slamming shut on a much larger building. The band kept playing for 4 full seconds before anyone understood what they were looking at, and those 4 seconds were the longest of Myra's life, because they were 4 seconds in which 300 people who had never seen the world of death stood directly beneath something that had crossed dimensions specifically to retrieve her, and did not particularly care who else it went through on the way. Evacuate the field. Handa's voice cracked across the PA system a heartbeat before the panic could properly start, buying the crowd 4 desperate seconds. Seconds Mira used to shed the pretense of being an ordinary 17-year-old anywhere the night could see her do it. She was halfway to the track before her brain caught up with her legs, moving through a stampede of fleeing classmates with the eerie, controlled economy of someone who had spent a year and a half learning that panic kills more people than monsters do. She caught her best friend Aiko by the shoulder mid-flight, spun her a hard 90 degrees toward the gymnasium doors, said, "Go, don't look back. I mean it," in a voice that left no room for questions, and kept moving before Aiko's face had even finished rearranging itself into confusion and fear. Behind her, teachers herded students into hallways with the frantic efficiency of people running a drill they'd never actually expected to need. Someone was screaming for the school nurse for no reason anyone could later explain, and somewhere above it all a knight's head turned, slow and deliberate, tracking a single figure crossing the open field against the tide of everyone else's flight. The knight found her 40 seconds later, exactly where she wanted to be found, alone past the emptied bleachers, with 300 yards of open field between her and the nearest classmate. World render. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It came from the armor itself, a sound like a bell struck underwater. You were declared forfeit. The throne requires your return. "Tell the throne," Mira said, dropping her school bag in the grass and rolling her sleeves with hands that had gone perfectly professionally steady, "that it should have read the fine print on my contract. I don't return. I finish things." The knight's blade came down like a falling building, and the girl who had ended a war stepped, not away, but into it, faster than a body her age had any business moving. Catching the flat of the blade on a length of steel she'd unclipped from her own belt in the same motion, a weapon that hadn't existed in this world's hardware stores an hour ago, and hadn't left her side in any world she'd fought on since. The impact drove her back 6 feet through the grass, cleats tearing furrows into the track's outer edge, and she felt it in her arms the way Handa had warned her she would, a jolt her old body would have absorbed without comment. And this one very much did not. She rode it out anyway, converting the stumble into a roll, coming up already moving, already reading the knight's next swing before its shoulder had finished turning. That, at least, hadn't changed. Some things a war teaches you don't live in the muscles. They live somewhere the body can't outgrow. For one strange, suspended second, the field around her seemed to fall away entirely, replaced by the memory of another field, another sky the color of a bruise, another version of herself standing over a throne that had just stopped breathing. She had thought in that moment a year and a half ago that finishing the war meant finishing the fighting. She understood now, watching the knight recover its balance for another swing, that wars didn't end just because one side ran out of things to lose. They ended when both sides ran out of reasons to keep sending soldiers, and clearly the throne hadn't run out yet. She let the memory go the way she'd been trained to let everything go mid-fight, filed for later, useless to her now, except as fuel. The fight that followed was not long, by the standards of the wars she'd survived. It was, however, the loudest thing Keed High School's grounds had witnessed in its 91-year history. She dodged twice, caught a third strike on the flat of her blade at an angle that sent sparks skating across the grass instead of through her ribs, and used the knight's own overextension to close the distance it should never have let her close. Up close, she could see what Handa's older files had only described. The seam where the knight's neck met its shoulders, a thin, dark line in armor that otherwise looked seamless, the one weak point every reclaiming knight was built with because whatever forged them had never quite learned to build anything without a flaw. It was the kind of detail you only found by fighting the thing, which was presumably why the ministry's files on knights were so thin. Most people who fought one didn't live to describe the seam. She drove for it on her next opening and missed by an inch, the knight twisting with a speed that shouldn't have belonged to something that size, its free hand closing around her forearm hard enough that she heard, more than felt, something in her wrist protest. Old instinct told her to shake it off and keep fighting through the pain the way she always had. New instinct, the one Handa had spent 3 nights trying to hammer into her, told her this body would not simply absorb that the way the old one had. She listened to the new instinct. She twisted with the grip instead of against it, let the knight's own pull swing her around its arm instead of tearing free of it, and used the momentum to plant both feet against its breastplate and shove off hard enough to put 6 feet of open air between them again, buying herself one more breath, one more look at the seam, one more chance. Her uniform jacket ended the fight in shreds. A gash along her forearm bled the ordinary, human red that would need an ordinary, human explanation by tomorrow. But on her 4th exchange, with the knight's blade buried in the earth where her head had been half a second earlier, she found the seam again, and this time she didn't miss. The knight didn't turn to ash the way the small creature in the stairwell had. It turned to silence, a held breath the world let out all at once, its armor folding in on itself like a puppet with its strings cut, and the tear behind it closed on its own, sealing shut with a sound like a held door finally releasing. 90 seconds, start to finish. She had counted, the way she always counted, because counting kept the panic where it belonged, filed away for later, never in the moment where it could cost her. Mira stood alone on the empty field, breathing hard for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, her wrist already swelling under her torn sleeve, and became aware, slowly, that she was not as alone as she'd planned to be. Aiko was standing at the gymnasium door, not fleeing, not screaming, just standing there, hand pressed flat against the glass, staring across 300 yards of ruined grass at the girl she'd shared a desk with since the first day of school, with an expression that wasn't fear exactly. It was something closer to recognition. Handa found her first, jogging across the ruined track with a first aid kit under one arm and an expression that was trying and mostly failing to look like ordinary teacherly concern rather than the relief of a man who genuinely wondered whether he'd be filing paperwork for a dead student tonight. Wrist? He asked, already reaching for it before she'd finished nodding. Sprained, not broken. It'll hold. She let him wrap it anyway, watching his hands move with the same unhurried competence he'd shown pouring tea 2 days earlier, like nothing that had happened on this field surprised him even slightly. You knew it would send a night eventually. I hoped it wouldn't be this soon. He tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels, looking past her at the scorched circle of grass where the tear had closed. A knight failing to retrieve its target doesn't just mean the throne loses a knight. It means the throne now knows for certain that you're here in this body, in this school. Every scout it sends from now on won't be guessing anymore. They'll be confirming. So it gets worse before it gets better. It gets worse before we find a way to close the nexus permanently instead of patching it every few days, Handa said, which is a much bigger job than one girl and one retired hunter can manage from a supply closet. I'm going to need to make some calls tonight. People I haven't spoken to in years who are going to have a lot of very inconvenient questions about why I let a war hero enroll in my literature class without reporting it. Tell them I have good attendance. Handa almost smiled at that, the closest she'd seen him come to it since this whole thing started. I'll be sure to mention it. He left her there to find Aiko, and Mira understood, without either of them saying it, that whatever came next wouldn't be something she could handle from inside a school supply closet alone. It was a strange, uncomfortable relief, the kind she hadn't let herself feel in a year and a half of pretending she didn't need one. You're not going to lie to me, Aiko said. It wasn't a question either. They were sitting on the gym roof after dark, the sports festival canceled. The school grounds quietly, efficiently repaired by people in unmarked vans that Handa had made 3 phone calls to summon, and that Mira strongly suspected did not officially exist. Someone had already reseeded the torn grass on the track. By tomorrow, there would be nothing left to point at except 300 students' memories, and Handa had a plan for those too. something involving a very convincing story about a special effects test for the drama club that had gone badly wrong. I've known you for 2 years, Mira. I know when you're about to lie. Mira considered several versions of the truth, weighed them the way she'd once weighed strategies against enemies who had already read her mind, and discarded every version that started with a lie, because Aiko was right, and because lying to her now, after tonight, would cost more than the truth would. I died in a war on another world, she said. I won it. Something there wants me back, and it's not going to stop sending things through until it gets its way, or until I finish whatever this is for good. Aiko didn't laugh, didn't call her crazy. She simply looked out over the dark track where hours ago, a 7-foot monster had tried to drag her best friend back to another dimension, and said, with the blunt practicality of someone who had just watched the impossible happen and decided to skip the part where she argued with it. Okay, so what do you need from me so this doesn't happen again with 300 people standing under it? It was, Mira realized, the single most useful question anyone had asked her since she'd woken up in her own bed a year and a half ago pretending nothing had changed. I need you to keep being exactly who you are, Mira said slowly, feeling her way toward an answer she hadn't let herself consider until this exact moment. Ordinary, visible, loud about things that don't matter, like volleyball boys and math homework. A reason for me to keep choosing this world over the one that wants me back. That's not nothing, Aiko. That might be the only thing keeping me human. That's a lot of pressure to put on someone whose biggest achievement this week was finishing a word puzzle in under 4 minutes. You're better at this than you think, Mira said, and meant it. Below them, out past the dark field, the last of the unmarked vans pulled away, and the school settled back into the shape of an ordinary building holding ordinary lives, the way it always did, the way Mira suspected it always would, right up until the next tier opened and reminded her that ordinary was a costume, not a cure. Aiko bumped her shoulder against Myra's, the small, unglamorous gesture of 2 friends sitting on a roof they weren't supposed to be on. For what it's worth, she said, you're still the worst person to copy math homework off of, even after all that. Mira laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising her as much as it surprised the quiet rooftop around them, and for one unguarded moment let herself feel exactly as young as her body insisted she still was. One more thing, Aiko said, when the laughter had settled and the wind off the dark field had gone quiet again. If something like that ever comes for you, and I'm standing close enough to help, don't send me away again. I get that you're trying to protect me, but I just watched you nearly get your arm taken off by a monster in armor. And if I'd known sooner what you actually were, maybe I could have cleared people out faster or covered for you with a teacher, or just done something. Don't make me useless on purpose. That's worse than being scared. Mira looked at her for a long moment, weighing the request the way she weighed everything now, and found, for once, that there was no strategic reason to refuse it. Deal, she said. But if I tell you to run, you run first and ask questions never. Obviously, I'm brave, not stupid. The next morning, room 2C smelled the same as it always had. Chalk dust, old varnish, the particular staleness of a building that had been standing since before any of its current students were born. Mr. Hander wrote the date on the board in handwriting that never changed. A boy in the front row argued about a video game. Someone passed a note 2 seats over that said, "Did you finish the math?" And this time Mira actually had. Nobody looked at her differently. Nobody whispered about the sports festival being canceled for reasons that made increasingly less sense the longer anyone thought about them. Because Handa's story about faulty pyrotechnics had done exactly what it was designed to do. Give 300 teenagers a boring explanation their brains were only too happy to accept over the alternative. Mira sat in the 3rd row from the window, 2nd seat from the back, her wrist wrapped under her sleeve in a bandage she'd tell anyone who asked was from tripping on the stairs, and let the ordinary morning noise settle around her, catalogued and dismissed, useful only for telling her that nothing had changed. Except something had. She knew now that Handa would be watching the nexus point beneath the school with more than a retired man's idle curiosity. She knew that Aiko would keep asking blunt, useful questions instead of flinching from answers most people would run from. She knew that the throne on the other side of the tear had lost a knight, and that the loss of a knight was not the kind of thing a throne simply let go of, not when it had already spent scouts and armor chasing one girl across a border between worlds it had no right to cross. 3 floors below the classroom, in the empty stairwell where the first tear had opened 6 days ago, a coin-sized point of violet light flickered once against the dark, and went out again before anyone was there to see it. It would be back. Mira already knew that. Tears like this one didn't stop coming just because you'd won once. They came back sharper, smarter, sent by something that had learned exactly how it lost the last 3 times and did not intend to lose a 4th. Somewhere on the other side of that flicker, in a throne room built from the bones of a war she'd already survived once, something was recalculating, weighing the cost of one more scout against the cost of something far worse than a knight. Handa had made his calls the night before, and from the tightness around his eyes this morning, not all of them had gone well. He hadn't told her yet what the ministry intended to do about a nexus point sitting under a school full of children, and she suspected, from the careful way he avoided the topic between attendance and the morning announcements, that the answer wasn't one she'd like. Wars, she was learning all over again, didn't stay contained to the people fighting them. They spread outward into supply closets and homework margins and rooftop conversations after dark, until everyone nearby was fighting some smaller piece of it whether they'd agreed to or not. Aiko caught her eye from across the room and gave her the smallest, steadiest nod. No fear in it, no performance, just the quiet promise of someone who intended to keep her word about not being sent away again. Mira nodded back and found, to her own mild surprise, that the gesture steadied something in her chest that 412 days of pretending everything was fine had never quite managed to reach. But for tonight, at least, homeroom could wait one more morning, and the hunter of the world of death let the schoolgirl keep her seat by the window, chalk dust and ordinary light and all, for exactly as long as the world allowed her to. End.